Welcome to our lecture in our fifth week, discussing way too briefly the role of Augustine as a bishop. And in this lecture, we're going to cover not enough, but what we will cover, I expect the student will describe the various movements that Augustine opposed. Why was Augustine writing what he was writing? I want the students to explore Augustine's responses. How did Augustine formulate his response to these various movements? And I would like the student to evaluate Augustine's theological claims on issues like the nature of truth, will and grace, just war, human nature, and God's purposes for history. So now that you've read Augustine's Confessions, you have had the story of Augustine through his conversion. And I believe when we leave Augustine at the end of Book 9 of the Confessions, he's in Ostia with his mother. Shortly thereafter, Augustine returns with his mother to his hometown of Tagaste. And he left his career in rhetoric. He kind of shuns this Roman celebrity and re-embraced his Punic and Berber roots. Now, this doesn't mean he rejected classical learning. It would be of a lot of use in his future ministry. But he did start to identify with his North African people. And the first texts that he starts to write, unsurprisingly, are texts opposing the Manichaeans. As a former Manichaean who found it unsatisfactory and who has found Christianity as satisfactory, Augustine points out that Manichaeism was really this unholy combination of Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism, actually. Manichaeism was a uniquely Asian system of thought that took hold in Africa, and it was opposed by Roman Christians. In his book On the Quantity of the Soul, he devoted this treatise to philosophical truth. Remember, he thought that Christianity was the fulfillment of this call to wisdom that he reads in the Hortensias. In his book On Free Will, Augustine rejected Manichaean determinism. Now, does this mean that Augustine believed in free will as the Wesleyans would later? No, but we'll get back to that. Augustine's philosophical quest for truth transformed him into a theological defender of orthodoxy. So in his treatise On the Teacher, he discusses language as a series of signposts pointing to ideas. Augustine is not trying to develop his own brand of Christianity. He is trying to pull all of Roman Christianity together for the benefit of his Punic and Berber brothers and sisters, right? Augustine wrote about a theory of knowledge, of mutable things, that he thought that knowledge came through the senses, of immutable things, that knowledge comes through wisdom, scientia and sapientia. All right. Augustine said the soul is like the eye and God is like the light. So even though Augustine rejected Manichaeism worldviews, he still used this language of light, which is also a biblical metaphor as well. On the usefulness of believing, Augustine argued that Manichaeans invert the order of things. Manichaeans must believe that one must see the truth in order to be purified. Augustine, interestingly, said that one must be purified in order to see, because there must be two things for knowledge, according to Augustine: a healthy eye, sick eyes can't see anything, and illumination. So Augustine started off arguing against Manichaeism with a Christian metaphysic. Now, around this time, Augustine was pastorally involved. He organized his friends and son into a monastic community where he would teach. He wrote a rule, a way to live your day, live your life. I'm sorry, he did not write a rule, but he did have a procedure for how one would live their life. And he developed certain principles: common property, common library, obedience. So he's drawing on these North African values as the foundation for leadership, right? Because of Augustine's thinking and because of his pastoral activity, he was very quickly ordained a bishop. In Augustine's opinion, probably too quickly. Augustine said, "The helm was handed to me who did not yet know how to hold an oar." And as a bishop, we see the role of a bishop changing slightly. We saw it earlier as someone ordained as a missionary to a certain area. Now in the 4th to 5th century, we see a bishop as one who is charged with protecting their flock from heresy, from heterodoxy. So Augustine took it upon him to write against Manichaeism, to write against Donatism, Pelagianism, and barbarianism, which we'll talk about. He was responsible for teaching the catechumens before baptism, presiding over communion, visiting the sick, as well as a number of administrative tasks. He instructed the readers, those young men seeking ordination as a priest. In this role, Augustine wrote one of my favorite texts from him, on Christian doctrine, or teaching Christianity, sometimes it's translated, De Doctrina. And Augustine develops this very helpful distinction in understanding one's faith of loving God for use and loving God for enjoy. Augustine basically said that the way God has created us is that we have a top shelf, and the only thing that belongs on that top shelf is God himself. And if we put anything else on that top shelf, we are not only not loving God the way that we should, is that we can't love anything else well either. So Augustine said there's two types of love. There's a love in which we use, that we can love anything in this world as long as it's used to love God better. That doesn't translate great in our society, because when we think of using people, that's generally a bad thing for us, right? That's not how Augustine's using this. Augustine is employing this word use to show that it's fine to use the things of this world to love God better. But God is the only one we are to properly enjoy, right? He is the ultimate end, telos, goal of all our love. So if God is in that top slot, we can actually love our family better and love our job better and love our hobbies better. But even when we take good things like our children, if we put our children in that slot that only God belongs in, then not only can we not love God well, we can't love anything else properly either. This is a properly ordered or a well-ordered love. So this illustrates some of the power of Augustine's pastoral thought. But in his role as a bishop, a lot of times he was called on as a theologian to protect his people. And one of the controversies that Augustine had to pretty much solve was the Donatist controversy. All right, if you remember, the Donatist controversy arose from the question of the lapsi, right? When persecution came to the Christian church, a lot of Christians lapsed. They gave in to the Roman government, and they made the sacrifices and offerings. And a lot of Christians didn't, and they were martyred. Then when persecution eased or disappeared, you had a lot of repentant Christians wanting to rejoin the church. And in our world today, that doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal, mainly because Augustine settled this question. But if you could put yourself in the shoes of someone who lost their wife or children or mother to martyrdom, and you had someone that took the easy way out, wanting to just walk right back into the church, I think we can understand some of the emotional problems that this would cause. But after Christianity became a legal religion with the rise of Constantine, it became very popular. And there were a lot of upper-class Christians, Roman Christians in North Africa, that embraced it. The problem was there was this not only theological divide between people that answered the question of the lapsi differently. there were ethnic and class divides as well. So let me give you the example of Lucilla. Lucilla was a North African Christian, and she had the bone of one of these martyrs, someone who was executed during the persecutions. And she would kiss the bone before communion, and she thought that the power of communion was due to the kissing of the bone over the sacrament itself. Now, the Catholic bishop in Rome, Caecilian, condemned this practice because the sacrament was ordained by Christ. It was ordained by the institutional church. The veneration of this bone was not ordained either by Christ or, at that time at least, the Catholic Church. And this highlights a difference between how the Punic and Berber North Africans viewed authority versus how the Romans viewed authority. Because the North Africans viewed authority as rooted in holiness, personal character. Authority was personal. The Roman Catholics, the Romans of North Africa, thought that authority was vested in the institution of the church, and what the church ordained made it good or made it bad, right? He thought that his position, that Caecilian's position as bishop, conferred upon him the authority to condemn or allow. So we can see how this Donatist controversy, the people that thought personal holiness was the standard and tended to exclude the lapsy, versus what we call the Catholics who believe more institutionally, we can see how this took on ethnic overtones, class overtones, and it became a political mess for a little bit. In AD 317, the emperor confiscated Donatist churches in North Africa. But then in AD 325, he extended clemency to the Donatists. This allowed Donatism to grow in greater numbers. So it increased the area of friction between the Donatist camp and the Catholic camp. So there became other rifts. The Caecilians, or who became known as the Circumcellians, they believed, the Roman institutionalists believed, that the way that you curb these Donatists was through violence, through cracking down on them. That just caused the Donatists to respond as well in violence. So this escalated. Throughout this period, there are times where tensions eased and tensions worsened, but it was never resolved in the early 4th century. 2 Donatists tried and failed to wrest power away from Rome in North Africa, Fermius and Gildo. So when Augustine became bishop, this Donatist controversy crossed his desk, in a manner of speaking, right? Augustine was born during a time of Catholic Roman institutional revival in North Africa. And Augustine actually opposed Donatism on theological and political grounds. Originally, Augustine was not a unique thinker on this. He wrote a book, a Psalm Against the Opinion of the Donatists. And he popularized arguments that Optatus of Milvius had against Donatism. But later on in his work Against the Epistle of Parmenium, Augustine said that the Christian church is a universal church. It is one church. It's not just restricted to North Africa. In other words, the personal concerns of the North Africans cannot dictate what the church as a whole believes. And we see 3 themes coming out of Augustine's opposition to the Donatists. And the first one is his beliefs on the nature of the church. And this was the main source of disagreement. Like we said before, the Donatists thought that the foundation for authority in the church was personal holiness, and therefore they excluded the lapsi, excluded the traditores. But Augustine concluded with Cyprian that it's impossible to sort the wheat from the chaff in this world. That was something that God did later on, and we looked at Matthew 13 to sort through that. Furthermore, Augustine did remind the Donatists that they were just as sinful as the Catholics. That even though they valued personal holiness higher, they were no more holy than the Catholics were. And what makes the church holy, according to Augustine, and this is key, it's not the personal behavior of its members. What makes Christians holy, what makes Christians saints, is its head, not its members. Because we are united to Christ, we are holy, not because we do holier things. And this was the beginning of the distinction we find in Puritanism between the church visible, the church that we see when we walk in the door Sunday morning, and all the people that are there, and the church invisible, the church as God sees it. But Augustine thought that that was not up to us to parse out. That was up to God to judge. So he supported the Catholicity of the church and tried to reconcile Rome to Carthage. And Augustine actually did hold the traditional Roman view of authority. Like I said, Augustine stands at the crossroads of this Berber, Punic, and Roman world. And even though when Augustine returned to North Africa, he identified as North African, he actually sided with the Romans on this issue. Another theme that we see in Augustine's writing against the Donatists was the validity of the sacraments. The Donatists thought that the ordination of Caecilian was invalid because he was ordained by the Roman Catholic tradition that extended leniency to these traditores. And therefore, not only was Caecilian invalidly ordained, anyone Caecilian baptized or ordained was invalidly ordained. And it brings up the question of baptism. If you were baptized in the Catholic Church, are you legitimately baptized in the eyes of North Africans? But Augustine concluded that baptism is valid not because of who performs it, but because of the institution by Christ himself, right? And I think this is where most of us fall these days. If it turns out that the pastor that baptized you wasn't really saved, it doesn't invalidate your baptism. The third theme that we see arising from Augustine's dealing with the Donatists was his response to violence. And this is something that survives into our day. So when the imperial church, the Catholic Church, was cracking down on Donatism, and Donatism was resorting to violence themselves to push back, Augustine started to develop what we now call just war theory, right? Augustine's mentor, Ambrose, used to be a pacifist. But when Ambrose saw these German barbarian hordes on the borders of the Roman Empire, these Arian heretics, Ambrose changed his tune and admitted that violence is necessary to preserve the Roman Empire, to preserve Nicene orthodoxy. And Augustine took his position a couple of steps further in developing a just war theory that guides American military decisions to this day. One of the tenets of just war theory is that war is a means to peace, that violent actions can be justified even against the circumcellions if it leads to peace. Secondly, war is just when it is authorized by a valid authority, and that's what the Donatists did not have. When it's prosecuted in a just manner, he talks about principles of proportionality and discrimination. Proportionality, you don't dole out a $50,000 response to a $5 crime, right? If one nation kills one of our citizens, we don't respond in killing 1 million of theirs. That's not proportional, Augustine would say. Discrimination, we have to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. And that is a major point of contention in the war with Hamas right now, right? So these principles are still being discussed. Augustine would also say that war must be waged with an attitude of love. That's a little harder to parse. We don't really know exactly what that's supposed to look like. Augustine said that all of this was justified violence against the circumcellions. So Augustine did not necessarily condemn the Donatists for their use of violence, even if at the end of the day he did not side with the Donatists, right? So this is one of these areas where Augustine seemed to settle, and this question of readmitting lapsed Christians back into the church is not as big of a deal today. However, some of the issues around just war theory is. So the second group Augustine had to confront as bishop, other than, well, the Manichaeans, the Donatists, so I guess the third group he confronted was the Pelagians. And Pelagius was a British priest, and he was very pious, he was very devoted. But then Pelagius heard a quote from Augustine's Confessions, "Give what you command, then command whatever you will." And Pelagius took issue with this. He thought it undermined people's personal responsibility, because if we did not do something, then Augustine seemed to imply that it was really God's fault, right? Pelagius' central concern, that Augustine shared actually, was to live a holy life. But for Pelagius, all of doctrine was measured against what leads to a holy life, what doesn't lead to a holy life. For Augustine, his standard was Scripture and the teaching of the church. And he thought if you follow Scripture, that is what defines a holy life, right? So Augustine's aim in bringing this issue up, of confronting this issue, was to promote holiness, actually. Now, Pelagius had a student, Cælestius, and he was not trying to promote holiness. Cælestius was trying to win a theological argument. So most of Augustine's pushback, while it's rooted in Pelagius, rightly so, probably came more through Cælestius. AD 431, the Council of Ephesus condemned Pelagius. Actually, Pelagianism, this, I don't think I've really defined it yet. Pelagius said that mankind has an ability to choose the good and the evil in equal measure. That there is nothing that is driving us to choose evil. In other words, Pelagius is denying original sin and its effect on our lives, right? Cælestius was accused of teaching that Adam's sin did not affect his descendants. And interestingly, he thought if there's no original sin, there's no reason to baptize infants. So yet we get another wrinkle in this baptismal controversy that we've already seen a couple of times, and we still have it in the church today between Baptists and Presbyterians and such. Pelagius thought that blaming someone for a choice made under the influence of original sin is like blaming a stone for falling. It can't do anything otherwise, so it's not to blame. And what Pelagius and Cælestius were actually doing was applying the principles of the Roman legal system to theological concerns. And this can be seen in Roman law treating the actions of slaves. If the slaves were obeying the decree of their masters, they could not be held liable for whatever it was. So according to Pelagius, God had to give equal ability to all in order to hold any person morally culpable. Pelagianism has since become the most consistently rejected doctrine in Christian history. Semi-Pelagianism, which we'll talk about on another occasion, is a close second there. But by AD 412, Augustine felt that he had to warn his flock about the dangers of this teaching. Now we know that Augustine had no problem with original sin, because even in his Confessions, he talks about how people are sinful as infants. And it's interesting. I agree with Augustine on original sin. I don't think that his example of infants is a particularly strong one, because Augustine said, well, we know babies are sinful because they cry. Well, maybe they're hungry. It seems awfully harsh, but if you have ever had young children, I had one daughter that did not sleep to the age of 4. Yeah, sometimes they do feel evil. that they're out to just make your lives miserable. So I do understand it. Understand Augustine's position a little bit there. So Augustine, following other thinkers like Tertullian, defended the idea of original sin, even in infants. And under Augustine's second book against the Pelagians, he clarified his approach to free will, because as we already said, when Augustine wrote against the Manichaeans, he wrote on free will. But what he was arguing against there is determinism. And Augustine was not a determinist. He did not think every action in life was determined by God. But he was also arguing against Pelagianism. So we'll see a lot of tough, what maybe looks like contradictions in Augustine's thought. They're not really contradictions, because we have to keep in mind Augustine was writing polemically. He was writing against specific positions, a lot of times taking a mediating position or even a third unrelated position. So we do have to keep that in mind when balancing these statements. Augustine made the argument that every human has concupiscence or corrupt desire. He said, we cannot be helped by God to sin, but we cannot do what is right or carry out the commandment of righteousness in every respect unless we are helped by God. And this is what Augustine referred to as grace. So Augustine identified 4 stages of anyone's life, well, specifically the Christian life. That when Adam was born, he was born under the state posse non peccare, able to not sin. We don't really know how the rules were different for Adam. It seems like they were, but we knew that Adam did not have to eat the fruit, right? He was able to not sin. But once Adam ate the fruit, he entered into a second phase, non posse non peccare, not able to not sin. That because original sin has been passed down from generation to generation, when we're born into this world, we were born with a disposition to displease God, to be enemies to God, right? And this is what we are drawn to. We are not able to not sin. But then Augustine says, when you accept Christ, when you become a Christian, a new creation, you return to that position that Adam had of posse non peccare, able to not sin. And as a Christian, I do have the ability to not sin. Unfortunately, I also have the ability to sin. But yeah, I don't get everything wrong, thankfully. But Augustine said that someday when we're glorified, we will enter another phase, one better than what Adam enjoyed, non posse peccare, not able to sin, right? So in explaining how the human is born into this world, by explaining what the Bible teaches about sinfulness and original sin, Augustine is able to argue against this Pelagianism that became very popular in the 5th century. And this is how Augustine carved out the role of grace, right? In his book on correction and grace, Augustine wrote, unless that defect is overcome with the help of grace, no one turns back to righteousness. Unless it is healed as an effect of grace, no one enjoys the peace of righteousness. Other places, Augustine wrote, grace begins to operate in us without us, so that we may believe and then cooperate with us. When it says without us, it means without our cooperation, on its own, right? And this led Augustine to recognize that God's salvific grace is given to some and not others, and this is a free act of God. And in response to God's imposing this grace on certain people, some people refer to it as a violence, right? That God was doing violence to us. So Augustine wrote, don't regard this violence as harsh and irksome. On the contrary, it is sweet and pleasant. It's the very pleasantness of the thing that drags you to it. Isn't a sheep dragged or drawn irresistibly when it's hungry and grass is shown to it? And I presume it is not being moved by bodily force, but pulled by desire, right? Grace is a divine imposition that pulls someone irresistibly to God. So we've talked about Augustine's writing against the Manichaeans, writing against the Donatists, writing against the Pelagians. And I believe the last one we're going to talk about is his writings against the pagans. We have to remember, during Augustine's life, the Roman Empire had become overextended. And it was too big to manage. And it was starting to crack and crumble due to internal problems of its size and its administration, due to external threats from the barbarian tribes. In AD 410, when Augustine was 56, the Goths under Alaric sacked Rome. They didn't destroy Rome. They didn't even stay in Rome, but they conquered it, they plundered it, and they left to come back another day, really. And this created shockwaves throughout the Roman Christian world. As we said, Christianity had been institutionalized with Rome as its center. And if Rome was threatened as its center, there was a question on what would happen to Christianity. Augustine understood the situation and responded by writing his magnum opus, The City of God. It is a substantial work that requires a commitment to get through, but you would be rewarded if you chose to take on that commitment. Augustine understood that throughout the book of Revelation, the city of Rome was used as the symbol of immorality, this new Babylon. But then he also understood it became the center of Christendom. So Augustine wrote The City of God to remind the Christian that Rome was never the central hope for the Christian. In this book, Augustine compared two great cities, the city of God and the city of this earth. And they're not physical cities. He's not talking about Rome and Carthage or Rome and wherever. But they were metaphors for two different orders to the world, orders of life. They're not literal cities. And the pagans claim that the rise of the Germanic barbarians and the sack of Rome was due to the rise of Christianity, right? That Rome had turned its back on its traditional pantheon. So of course Jupiter was upset and was going to undermine this new Christian god at his first opportunity. Augustine argued that the calamities that he saw in the empire in his lifetime were no bigger than those of the past, and therefore not the result of Christianity. Rome had a lot of problems in its past, even before there was a Christianity. So Augustine argued you can't pin it on Christians. So Augustine collects this treasury of classical history to demonstrate the reasons for the rise and fall of empires. So Augustine wrote, "Two loves founded two cities. The love of self to the point of neglecting God founded the earthly city, and the love of God to the point of neglecting self founded the heavenly one. The first glories in itself, and the second glorifies God above everything else. The first boasts of its own glory, and the second says to God, 'You are my glory, and it is you who allow me to hold my head high.' The first rules over the princes and the nations that it has subjected under the impulse of concupiscence for power. In the second, all serve one another in mutual love, the rulers advising and the subject obeying." These two cities, according to Augustine, survive parallel to one another, and they're intermingled in this world. Notice the parallels with the Donatist controversy. And the conflicts between them will continue, that they have always been in conflict, and they will continue to be in conflict until the end, when the heavenly city wins and God separates the wheat from the chaff. So since these two cities are intermingled, the Christian can't ignore the earthly city. But it's these two loves that vie for the soul of the individual. The problem isn't what's happening with the barbarians in Rome. Augustine makes the argument the problem is what's happening in the heart of his people. And I do apologize. This is a way too brief survey of Augustine's ministry. But unfortunately, Augustine is so large a figure, it would take more than an entire course to cover it all. So this is what's going to have to do. appreciate your patience. Thank you.